All right, man, peace. You know, brothers, I remember growing up as a little kid back in the 1980s, and one of my favorite films to watch when I would come home from school was Empire Strikes Back. I like Return of the Jedi also, but Empire Strikes Back was my favorite because it was very operatic, extremely theatrical, great action scenes. It was wonderfully edited. Of course, being 6, 7, 8 years old, I'm not even thinking on that level. But you know a good movie when you're watching it. Of course, they had Darth Vader, who was a classic villain, Luke Skywalker, who was a hero who was trying to find himself, and notable characters like Han Solo, Princess Leia, Chewbacca, Yoda, etc. So as I got older, entered junior high school and then high school, what George Lucas started to do was remaster the original Star Wars trilogy and actually re-release them back into the theaters. That happened in like 1994 or 95, one of those years, maybe 96, because that was going to be in anticipation or to build up a lot of the energy for the new Star Wars trilogy that was going to emerge in 1999. So of course that film, The Phantom Menace, hit theaters and I went to see it and I enjoyed it. Even though it was panned by critics, I thought that it was good, and being that I was a fan of the franchise, the series per se, there was not much that I found at fault with it. I thought that they spent a little bit too much time with Anakin Skywalker as a little boy. Why am I saying all this? Because as you grow older, you revisit old movies and you see certain elements that you did not notice before, because all films, as I state to you brothers repeatedly, have a supraliminal understanding and a subliminal understanding. In the aftermath of the quote-unquote 9/11 World Trade Center attacks in 2001, when I went back and I watched The Phantom Menace, and this was years down the line, maybe 2006, 2007, I started to understand what George Lucas was trying to communicate in the film The Phantom Menace. The antagonists in that film were the quote-unquote Trade Federation, who were a group of aliens who were being manipulated by Chancellor Palpatine, who was what we would call today a congressman for the old republic. He was using them as a proxy enemy, as controlled opposition, as we would say, to be the face of the antagonist so that he could subvert the republic and raise up a dictatorship, what will come to be known as the Empire in the original trilogy. I say all that because, once again, when I rewatched The Phantom Menace, it became clearer and clearer to me that George Lucas was in the know on what was going to be planned in 2001 and onward, and he analogized what was going to transpire utilizing predictive programming in his film, with once again the Trade Federation representing the quote-unquote Arabs of the Middle East, Islam, which was going to be demonized, of course the Trade Federation representing the people who controlled the oil and a lot of the natural resources within the Middle East. Chancellor Palpatine became an analogy for George Bush and a lot of the quote-unquote dark witches of the political world at that time within America, Britain, etc. For those of you who don't know, the Jedi represent quote-unquote good witches, the Sith represent quote-unquote bad witches. Everyone within the higher levels of entertainment are witches, and the political sphere is a component of the entertainment world. So whether it's George Bush, Dick Cheney, your top Congress people, your top directors and producers in Hollywood, your top anchors on television, your top Congress women, notable figures from overseas, they're all in on it. I don't care what religion they claim to partake in, whether it's Catholicism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism. Behind the scenes, they adhere to their approximation of the Babylonian Kemetic mystery school system. They don't fully understand it like how the ancients did, but they still draw power from the adherence and the worship of the horn god, the mother goddess, and their son. But just to get back to the point, once again, the Trade Federation was meant to be a metaphor for the quote-unquote Arab world and how they were going to be used as the fall guys by those who are really in power. I'm saying all this because it's very apparent to me that after the demise of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, they're going to concoct another antagonist, another member of quote-unquote ISIS or Al-Qaeda is going to be risen up, whatever you want to call that fake theatrical enemy that is going to necessitate and validate the presence of Western forces in the Middle East. There's always going to be someone to replace who they remove. And they remove these figures to gain political favor amongst the masses, to make the people think that they're actually doing something that they're not doing. They're controlling both sides. It's all scripted. Don't get it twisted. People are actually being killed. Now, when it comes to al-Baghdadi, do I believe that they actually killed him? Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. But when you research his background, it's also very obvious that he was a member of controlled opposition and he was put under mind control. But I'm going to cover that as we go over this segment here. Of course, they're going to talk about it. I'm going to chime in.
This morning, U.S. intelligence agencies are sifting through highly sensitive information that was gathered in the daring U.S. raid on the ISIS leader's compound in northwestern Syria.
And once again, brothers, that's why George Lucas entitled that first film, when he was trying to reinvigorate the Star Wars franchise, The Phantom Menace, because a phantom is something that you think exists, but it really doesn't. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, those are not really existent enemies of the quote-unquote Western world. They're contrived opposition.
President Trump says the terror group's leader, that's Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, killed himself during that weekend attack. Now, this is a big victory for President Trump, who is accused of giving a lifeline to ISIS when he pulled American troops out of northern Syria.
Once again, the reason why they chose the acronym of ISIS for the quote-unquote enemy of the Western world is because they're trying to let you understand that it is under the energy of the Mother Goddess that they're receiving their blessings, as they believe them to be. Because let's pay very close attention. The actual acronym is ISIL, I-S-I-L. I believe it's the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. But they changed it to ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, because they're trying to give you hints. Very similar to the bombing that occurred in Colombo, Sri Lanka. I did a video about it. That was another way for them to give you the hint that it was all done in the veneration of the Mother Goddess. They bombed that city of Colombo, which means the dove goddess, another allusion to the Mother Goddess Easter, and they did it on Easter.
U.S. located Baghdadi using information provided by prisoners, including one of his in-laws who met with the ISIS leader on a regular basis. Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett is at the White House with more on this story. Major, so what else do we know this morning about that raid?
Well, good morning, Gail. We know that the Army's elite Delta Force took the lead. About 70 American commandos participated in this raid. It took about 4.5 hours. No U.S. military personnel were killed, 2 were injured, and there were injuries suffered by a military dog.
Brothers, whenever these removals are orchestrated, it's always just to build more political clout for the quote-unquote president who's in office. With Obama, he removed their asset known as Osama bin Laden on May 1st of 2011. Once again, May 1st is on Beltane. That's also for the Mother Goddess. It's also for the quote-unquote Oak King, which was just another name for Kush or Bel. That's why it's known as Beltane. And Hitler was also removed on May 1st. So that just goes to let you know how long they've been orchestrating history as an allusion to the divine quote-unquote Trinity on the left-hand side, the horned god, the Mother Goddess, and their son.
While 5 of Baghdadi's terrorist associates were killed in the raid on the compound.
He didn't die a hero, he died a coward. Crying, whimpering, screaming, and
President Trump described the final moments of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi.
And brothers, this dude does not even look like he's from the Middle East. He looks like Vinny Tortino from the pizza parlor around the corner. I mean, give me a break.
Baghdadi as a contrast in terrorist bravado and American resolve.
Forget about it, no doubt about it.
Allegedly shows the raid.
The thug who tried so hard to intimidate others spent his last moments in utter fear, in total panic and dread, terrified of the American forces bearing down on him.
Once again, brothers, all of that rhetoric is simply for political clout. Trump knows that right now he's under siege by his political enemies, so he says, you know what, let's remove one of our prime assets who's playing the villain. We can always replace him. This is going to be a great political ploy for myself to justify why I should be quote-unquote voted into office again. They'll have someone to replace him in no time. That's why it's a great strategy to have, to always manipulate the public consciousness by having a nebulous opposition out there somewhere who you never know they can accuse of wanting to bomb Western civilization, make everyone into some type of strident or ardent Muslim. They'll claim that they don't respect women, when in all actuality, their paradigm for understanding women is far better than Western culture. There's a reason why so many men and women in Western society are on antidepressants. It's because we're far too liberal with what we allow our women to do. The woman sits back when she has too much time on her hands trying to figure out how she can cause confusion in her own life and in other people's lives. In the Middle East, they don't tolerate that bullshit from the woman.
Trump said fresh intelligence on Baghdadi's likely location and where he might move set the mission in motion 3 days ago. U.S. forces took off from a military base in Erbil, Iraq, flying 8 helicopters, low and fast, for the roughly 1 hour and 10-minute trip to the location. Once there, forces blasted a hole through the side of the compound, catching those inside by surprise. Baghdadi fled to an underground tunnel.
He ignited his vest, killing himself.
Or maybe that was just part of his programming. Maybe he was put through self-destruct programming and it was time for him to go. You know, brothers, when you study this person, Baghdadi, and his origins, at least to me, it's rather obvious that he was an asset. He was someone who was placed under programming. That's if he was not some type of intelligence agent from Britain or America. But I believe that he was just someone who was kidnapped off the streets. By the way, 90% of the prisoners who were detained in some of these camps or quote-unquote detainment centers back in the early 2000s were placed there erroneously. Over 90% were innocent Iraqi men. A lot of them were supposedly radicalized in Abu Ghraib or Camp Bucca, but could you blame them? Those soldiers were forcibly sodomizing them, forcing them to perform homosexual acts on one another, electrocuting them, waterboarding them. So if they were not radicalized Muslims before they entered some of those camps, of course they were going to be after they left. Now, in the case of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, I have very little doubt that he was put under the mind control programming and sent out to be a prop and an asset so that he could be manipulated down the line, which is what we've seen. Now, here's one of the main reasons why I believe that he's an asset. There was a report from a Muslim publication out of Bahrain that claimed that there was a program that was initiated by the United States, Israel, and Britain known as Operation Hornet's Nest, in which they concocted the idea for ISIS to act as a buffer in between the state of Israel and Iraq and Iran. That would also validate the presence of the U.S. and Britain in that region, so that not only could they try to westernize the region as much as possible, but also so that they could take the natural resources. There are certain people who have tried to debunk this. Supposedly this story came from Edward Snowden, the quote-unquote whistleblower from the NSA. The reason why I believe it to be something is because according to the records from the U.S. military, Baghdadi was detained at Camp Bucca in 2004. But according to the memory of the commander over that facility by the name of Kenneth King, he was there from 2005 to 2009. Now, when Kenneth King was confronted with the understanding or with the official records from the U.S. government stating that Baghdadi was only there in 2004, he tried to divest himself of his original statements. The reason why they don't want people to know that Baghdadi was there from 05 to 09 is because no one wants to blame Barack Obama for being the president who would have been in power when Baghdadi was released. Supposedly 9 of the chief officials of ISIS were detained in Camp Bucca at the same time, and they allegedly were radicalized at that same time. I believe that there was something more nefarious afoot, especially in regards to Baghdadi. I believe that he was placed under mind control. I have very little doubt about that. When you brothers get the chance, look up someone by the name of Patrick Skinner. He's a former CIA operative who claims that the history or the official biography of al-Baghdadi is a complete myth. Now, Patrick Skinner, once again, he used to be a CIA field operative. Now he's a police officer in Savannah, Georgia. So that just goes to show you. A lot of these police officers, firefighters, other government officials, they're fluid. They flow from one alphabet agency to another. And there's no such thing as a former CIA operative because you're privy to a lot of sensitive information. So some of these quote-unquote top cops, as they're called, are also intelligence agents. Now, Patrick Skinner, I believe he's also associated with an organization known as the Soufan Group, spelled S as in Sam, O-U, F as in Frank, A-N, which is a privatized intelligence organization that's led by a man by the name of Ali Soufan, who's a former FBI anti-terrorism expert who himself claims that he could have stopped, or he believes that he could have stopped the World Trade Center attacks in 2001 had the CIA been willing to share information with him. Well, the problem with that is that why would they share information with you if 9/11 was possibly an inside job? And I put possibly in quotes. I'll also say this. I believe that Mr. Soufan, Ali Soufan, is a Jesuit because he's a member of a fraternity that is based in Catholicism. I believe that the name of the fraternity is Phi Kappa Theta. So I have very little doubt that this rabbit hole is very deep, which you would expect it to be when they're trying to get people to run around.
And the 3 children. His body was mutilated by the blast.
A test of Baghdadi's scattered remains, Mr. Trump said, confirmed the identity. The president credited cooperation from Russia, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria.
Russia treated us great. They opened up. We had to fly over certain Russia areas.
Once again, it's very important that brothers understand this. The reason why all the world leaders are known by the title of president or prime minister is because they're servants. They're not really rulers. They're members of the executive branch within their countries. Of course, there are disagreements, but for the most part, behind the curtain, they're all working together. They're presidents. President is a corporate title. The world is ran as a global corporation.
The Syrian Kurds, who have seen the U.S. withdraw from the country as a betrayal, also played a role.
They gave us some information that turned out to be helpful.
While some Republican lawmakers were notified Sunday morning about the raid, other congressional leaders, including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, found out.
Yes, most likely Israeli Mossad plants, or what they call, quote-unquote, Jewish Defense League.
Out when the rest of the world did.
It's great that we've gotten al-Baghdadi and killed him. He's a dangerous man, an evil man. The fight against ISIS has to continue.
All these top or prominent politicians are actors.
The raid was codenamed after Kayla Mueller, an American aid worker and one of Baghdadi's victims. On Sunday, Tony, President Trump called the families of Americans killed at the hands of ISIS.
Hey brothers, a lot of you out there who may have seen the film Iron Man 3, that was another film that basically was trying to reveal to you that Osama bin Laden, as well as people like Baghdadi, are actors. They took a character who in the comics was a real villain of Iron Man, known as the Mandarin, and they turned him into an actor in the movie. And behind the scenes, he was being puppeted by AIM, which was a corporation that, of course, was based in the United States. It's the same convention as George Lucas was trying to communicate in the film The Phantom Menace.
Major Garrett Forrest, Major, thank you. Mueller and at least 3 other American civilians, James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, and Peter Kasich, are among the thousands of deaths blamed on ISIS. At its peak in 2015, the terror group controlled large sections of Syria and Iraq. Holly Williams has covered its rise and its fall. Holly, good morning. So how much is Baghdadi's death likely to damage the group he founded?
It's not going to damage it at all, because Baghdadi did not found ISIS. ISIS was found a long time ago, thousands of years ago, when man first started to worship the quote-unquote mother goddess. All ISIS is a personification of the quote-unquote divine feminine, worshipped in the ancient world as Eve and also as Semiramis.
Well, good morning. Well, at the very least, this is a symbolic blow to ISIS, because remember, this is the man who stood up in a mosque in Iraq 5 years ago and declared himself the caliph or leader of a so-called Islamic State. After their split from Al-Qaeda, he led ISIS to the peak of their violent rampage, ruling over an estimated 10 million people at one point, enslaving women, carrying out gruesome executions, and exporting terror to Europe and the US.
Let's keep one thing in mind. There are certain indignities that are done to women in those parts of the world because sometimes they do take their act a bit too far. But when the modern mainstream media use the term enslavement of women, what they often mean is that women are forced to marry men that they're not quote unquote in love with. They still have arranged marriages in that part of the world. Now, I will say this, many times there are ritual rapes that are performed and committed against women, where women are forced to have intercourse with certain prominent men against their will. But many times when the mainstream media uses terms like that, inflammatory terms, all they're saying is that they're not allowing women to choose who they want to have sex with from night to night.
ISIS was never about one man. It is about an ideology. It is an extreme and violent interpretation of Islam.
Yes, it's set up to basically be the Arab world version of the Marvel Cinematic Universe enemy known as Hydra. When you cut off one head, a whole bunch of other people are going to come back and take the place of that head. It's the same thing with ISIS. That's why it makes the perfect enemy or the perfect antagonist to the quote-unquote Western world. because they never really go away. And they're always going to justify the presence of the Caucasian in the Middle East as long as they need justification to go over there and take natural resources or do whatever they need to do. We have to understand what the U.S. military is. The U.S. military is a collection agency. That's all it is. Their job is to go overseas and take natural resources from lands that are rich in natural resources.
Some would say a perversion of Islam, and that doesn't end with Baghdadi, and that doesn't end with ISIS. Other jihadist groups have replaced their leaders quite quickly when they've been killed, and there's little doubt that ISIS will do the same. One likely successor is a character known as Abu Abdullah Kardash.
Oh, there goes another guy that looks like Vinny from around the corner in the pizza parlor. Hey, forget about it, no doubt about it.
Like Baghdadi, he apparently spent time in a prison camp in Iraq following the US invasion of 2003.
Yes, he probably was put under mind control as well.
That camp became an incubator for jihadis. President Trump said yesterday that Baghdadi's caliphate has been, quote, obliterated. And it's true that ISIS lost control of its last remaining patch of territory in Syria in March. But the Pentagon's watchdog says that ISIS still has up to 18,000 members in Syria and Iraq. And in eastern Syria, that's the area from which President Trump ordered US troops to withdraw this month. Kurdish forces say they're holding up to 12,000 accused ISIS fighters. An American general described those prisoners to me last month as a, quote, contained fighting force. So Baghdad...
Brothers, the fighting force of ISIS is equivalent to the droid army of the Trade Federation. For those of you who've seen The Phantom Menace, you know what I'm talking about. The reason why George Lucas uses the metaphor of the droid army is because he's trying to say that all these men are robots. They don't even really know why they're doing what they're doing. And then remember, in the sequel, Attack of the Clones, that was his way of saying that a lot of these U.S. soldiers and Western soldiers are going to be genetically modified, genetically engineered. And a lot of them are actually going to be clones.
But ISIS is still very much alive. Gail.
Right, more work to be done there. Thank you very much. Holly Williams reporting from Istanbul. CBS News senior national security contributor and former acting CIA director, that's Michael Morell, is with us now from Washington. He was, by the way, CIA deputy director when Osama bin Laden was killed in a U.S. raid in Pakistan. Michael.
So that means that he's read Osama bin Laden's real file, not the bullshit that people get told.
So much for joining us. You know, yesterday the president seemed to imply that this death was much bigger than the death of Osama bin Laden. I think most people weren't even aware there was a competition. But can you put this in perspective?
Well, Gail, was he really trying to imply that there was a competition? Or is he just saying that, in his view, al-Baghdadi was more powerful than bin Laden? And we know that he's a politician, so of course he's going to try to talk up his achievements. We know that whether it's Obama or Trump, they're all pretty much full of shit, and they want to push as much bombast as they can to get people to think that they're actually fighting for freedom, when in all actuality they're just fighting for the supremacy of America.
What this really means?
Yeah, so there wasn't a competition. Both operations were very significant, significant setbacks for Al-Qaeda and
both operations were very ritualistic. That's all they were. They were not setbacks for anybody, because every 2 weeks the mainstream media claims that ISIS is growing in power, and then supposedly they're receding in power, and then they're growing in power. So it's very clear that there's a manipulator behind the scenes, but it's not the leader of whoever the mainstream media claims ISIS has.
Case and ISIS in Baghdadi's case. So Baghdadi was still the operational leader of ISIS. He was guiding the resurgence of ISIS. So even though they lost their caliphate earlier this year, they were in the process of resurging. 10 to 30,000 operatives on the Syria-Iraq border. He was helping to orchestrate that, and he was also the group.
This dude Baghdadi looked just like Al Capone. Ain't no way in the world you're gonna tell me this dude's a real Iraqi. What the hell is going on?
Inspirational leader, as Holly mentioned. So with
all jokes aside, though, brothers, most of the inhabitants of what they call the Levant, even going up into Iraq, they're descendants of the Ottoman and the Seljuk Turks who intermixed with the indigenous people there. A lot of the indigenous or aboriginal people were pushed all the way out. Many of them, they won't even put on television.
Him, they lose both of that. History has shown us, Gail, that when you take a terrorist leader off the battlefield, It takes a while for the replacement to find their way, to learn the job.
It takes a while for the replacement to find their way and learn the job. Well, where did they go to learn the job, Mr. CIA Director? Could it be in your training facility?
Setback, and most important, it sends a message to all the leadership that they're at risk, and they start worrying more about their own security than they do about running their group and thinking about operations. So it is a setback, definitely. ISIS will not go away just because of this, but it is a setback.
Wow, that's a very strange declarative statement to make. He said ISIS will not go away. Shouldn't you be a bit more positive and optimistic than that, seeing as you're the head of the American intelligence agency that is expected to gain some inroads on what was making ISIS work, what makes them tick? You're saying without a shadow of a doubt that ISIS is just going to keep on ticking. They take a lick and they just keep on ticking, huh? I guess it's because you know that the only way that they're going to stop is when you tell them.
Michael, what's the significance of where Baghdadi was found?
So Anthony, I'm not sure there's much significance. A lot's been made that this is Al-Qaeda territory. But after the caliphate collapsed, a number of ISIS fighters made their way from the part of Syria and Iraq where they were to this part of northwestern Syria, which is sort of a no man's land. So I'm not sure it's of significance in any way beyond the best place to hide.
Michael, President Trump says that U.S. forces on the ground took, quote, highly sensitive material and information, end quote, in the raid. What would you be looking for in that material?
They would be looking for any material that might implicate the CIA or any other intelligence agencies as being the fountain of wisdom for people like Baghdadi. Because many of these soldiers, they have no idea what the hell's going on until they find certain information, and then all of a sudden they might become a whistleblower. Remember that safety from the Arizona Cardinals who supposedly got killed through friendly fire? Why do you think that happened?
Absolutely. Good question. I think 4 things. One is any current plots or operations. That's the first thing you look for. The second would be, how is the organization actually working today? How is it communicating with each other? How is money moving? How is it operating on a day-to-day basis? Third, the leadership. Who's in charge, in what position, how do they interact with each other, who's important, who's not, and then lastly, big strategic plans and intentions. Those are the 4 things you're going to be looking for.
So you mean to tell me that you guys have satellites up in the atmosphere that can watch a grasshopper scratch its ass, but you can't find some of these people who supposedly are leading ISIS?
All right, Michael Morrell, thank you very much, Michael. A manhunt is on.
But anyway, brothers, that's basically it on this storyline. We'll see how things go with the ISIS narrative. So peace.